Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin momentarily. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Take your seats, please. The program begins now.
Gonna sit. $350 billion. The amount of damage that the World Bank estimates has been done to Ukraine by Russia since February 25th. $105 billion. The amount of aid that the United States has given to Ukraine since February 25th, that is military and economic, including the latest supplemental, $105 billion in 10 months. And over 100,000 casualties. The estimate, yes, for Russia's dead and wounded by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, but it is also the estimate of the number of Ukrainians who have been killed and wounded since this war began. Petro Poroshenko does not need an introduction. He's the 5th president of Ukraine, also former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Trade and Economic Development, and the former head of the Council of the National Bank. Mr. President, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Nick.
Let me read 2 quotations for you. Andrei Yermak said this yesterday: "There will be peace when not a single Russian soldier remains on Ukrainian soil. There are 2 ways to achieve that peace. The Russian soldiers can either leave Ukrainian soil or rest in Ukrainian soil. We leave the choice of wording to them." Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, 10 days ago: "There has to be a mutual recognition that military victory is probably, in the true sense of the word, maybe not achievable through military means, and therefore you need to turn to other means. So when there's an opportunity to negotiate, when peace can be achieved, seize it. Seize the moment." Who's right, Mark Milley or Andrei Yermak?
Nick, this is a very good question. And that's why we are here today. And I want to thank the person because of whom we are here. This is from all of my heart, from all of Ukrainian people. I want to say gratitude to the Peter, a friend of Ukraine, a friend of us. And not only Peter, but the whole team who doing a fantastic job for make world safer. Great job, Peter. Second, before answering on the Nick question, I want to tell you that today, with the blue and yellow flag, Ukraine saved the world. And this is not a parasol, this is the shield which Ukraine built together with our Western partners to protect the world against the Russia's evil, against crazy maniac Putin. And I want to kindly ask you to pay a tribute to Ukrainian armed forces, which we jointly created since year 2014, to the Ukrainian soldiers, to Ukrainian officers, to the Ukrainian volunteers, and to the Ukrainian general, including General Zaluzhny, the Iron General, who is the organizing the armed forces and surprise the world and surprise the Putin. Now about the war, Nick. Can you imagine that we have this war almost 9 years? In 2.5 months, it would be 9 years. And in year 2014, we already stopped the Putin and stopped his scenario to divide Ukraine and create the project Novorossiya. Half of Ukraine should be under Russian power. And we then together threw them away from Mariupol, from Lysychansk, from Severodonetsk, from Slaviansk, from Kramatorsk, from Konstantinovka. If you wake me during the night and say me, I know exactly how we make free every single town on the Donbass. Most of them now are occupied. Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Rubezhne, Popasne. And I have no doubt they will be free. Why it's happened? Because we are together. And with that situation, this is the real disastrous war. When we stop Putin on the front line with brave Ukrainian soldiers, Putin opened the war against our children, against our women, against our elderly people. And he now spent more cruise missiles and Shahed drone against civilians than on the front line. What was happening during the last 24 hours? The air alert would take 5 hours in Kyiv. Again, missiles. During the last 24 hours, 17 hours it was no electricity during the winter. No water, no heating, no electricity. And my nation demonstrated unique features. What is the difference between Ukraine and Russian? Russians are afraid of Putin. If that would be that type of pressure, Russians accept. And that was exactly the same scenario because Putin thinks that Ukrainian will act exactly like Russian. If he attack us, we flee from the country, like Russian fled from the mobilization. Instead of that, we are even stronger. The first hours of the 24th February, we have in our office on Lavskaya 2,000 people who want to enlist in the armed forces of Ukraine. And the world is different. World before 24th of February and world after 24th of February. And what is the main messages for Putin? And I'm happy to hear that yesterday from the Secretary Austin. First message. In the present world, no nation in the world can define the future of the other sovereign nation and can have a veto right for their future. And second message, no nation can change the border of other sovereign nation by force. That is the main principle of the international law. And we never can accept these type of things. Next position is, what is the, and now I'm closer to the Nick question. What is the peace? Does there exist any other nation in the world who want peace more than we Ukrainians? No, because we pay the highest price for that. How we understand the peace? There is no Milley version, Yermak version, or anybody else. There is just two versions of the peace. Version number one is Putin version. What is the peace under Putin terms? This is a ceasefire. For what? For preparing, renewing the fighting combat capabilities of Russian armed forces. And for that, we have several recommendations, Nick. First, please, don't trust Putin. I know what I'm saying because I 5 years was a president and have a very difficult talks and trying not to stay alone. We have the whole G7, the whole NATO behind. Don't trust Putin. And second, don't be afraid of Putin. Learn from Ukraine. We demonstrate that Putin is not so strong, not so united. He is evil, but we are stronger. With that situation, is it acceptable, the Putin version of ceasefire? No. Because we have in our history several agreement, memorandum, deal with Putin, and just want to remind you. In year 1994, we have a Budapest memorandum with a firm security guarantee from Russia and from whole world when we voluntarily give up third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. Can you imagine if we have a nuclear weapons, does it happen what we have now? Most probably not. But we, that time, trust. In year 1997, we have a so-called big treaty with a security guarantee from Russia. On paper, ratified, everything. This does not save us. After any other Russian obligation in the year 2014, 2015, we have a 3 memorandum, protocol, and agreement in Minsk, where we have absolutely clear message. Respect territorial integrity, withdrawal of foreign troops, withdrawal of heavy artillery and weapons, release all the hostages. In these documents, and the most important thing in this document, this is the Putin's signature on it. Does it save us from the intervention? No. What is the conclusion? Don't trust Putin. Putin understands only one thing, strength and our unity. How we can reach that? You said through negotiation. Fully agree with that. Without negotiation, it's not happening. When we can start negotiation? It's already going on. And we have a very good, very well prepared, very professional negotiator, which is supported by you and by the whole world. Do you know the name of this negotiator? Armed Forces of Ukraine. Putin was against to withdraw his troops from Kiev. And we stay since the very first hours on the 24th in Kiev with the weapons in the hands. All our team in the battalions of the territorial defense having the Putin troops 2 kilometers from my office. We have a successful negotiation and threw Putin away from Kiev region. Then we have a successful negotiation through Putin away from Chernihiv region, then from Sumy region. A few months ago, we have a very great successful negotiation round and threw Putin away from the Kharkiv region. And a few days ago, from Kherson region. 50% of the occupied territory, because of this negotiation, returned back under Ukrainian sovereignty. What other negotiator you are looking for? My recommendation. No. So it would be no Milley version, no Yermak version, but Poroshenko version. Please accept that.
If, and I'll just ask one question to go to the audience. If there is only total victory, that's the only option. If the Zelensky peace plan, which includes Russia must reaffirm the territorial integrity of Ukraine, Russia must withdraw all its troops, and a special tribunal and international compensation, if that is not negotiable. So if Ukraine thinks that it can win, if the peace plan is non-negotiable, which is what you're saying, does the US, does Canada, does the West need to acknowledge to its public two things: that there is a threat of escalation by Russia, perhaps including nuclear, that the West needs to be willing to accept, and that number that I said, $105 billion so far from the United States alone in 10 months, does the West need to tell its population, its public, that that kind of support is going to be needed, perhaps even indefinitely?
I tell you two things. First of all, about the population. Now for the Ukrainians, it's extremely difficult to be without money, without job, without electricity, without houses, to be internally displaced person. Enormously difficult. But I want to send a message from Ukraine. We are not traded by our democracy, by our freedom, by our sovereignty, for the electricity, for commodities, for gas, for oil, and we count on your support. You are absolutely right about $105 billion. I know something about army and about money. This is the cheapest version for the United States to protect global security, because this is not a war for Ukraine and about Ukraine. This is the war for the global security. Because if we will not win this war, Russia will transfer the nuclear technology to Iran. We have a significantly more instability in the world, and that would cost to the world significantly more amount of money.
And quickly,
That's
escalation?
why-
Should the West be worried about escalation? Should the West be worried about possible escalation if Russia's about to lose?
Look, we should create the condition that escalation, we do not allow Putin to make an escalation. How we can do that? 5 steps. Not strategy for peace, but strategy for victory, because we can have a peace only through the victory, our joint victory. Point number 1. 3 sub-point in point number 1. This is weapons, weapons, and weapons. And this is the maximum the West can do for make peace closer. Point number 2, sanction and embargo. 1 year ago, they said, no, this is not possible. Please, everything is possible. We should now cut the price to Russian gas, cut the price to Russian oil. Because can you imagine that $900 million a day the Western world finance Russia? And Putin spent this money for killing Ukrainians. What are the arguments you need for make sanction exterritorial, for cut and stop buying any Russian products, not only oil and gas? Russia toxic. And everybody who touch Russia is toxic. And we should be decisive. Point number 3. This is the justice. How we can finish the war without justice? If anybody has any doubts, please not see the film about Bucha, about Chernigov, about Irpin, about Vorzel, about Gostomel, about Trostianets and Sumy region, about Mariupol. Yesterday we have very, very good film. Please pay time and see that.
And I think
we need a justice and we need a Hague tribunal for that. Without that, it would not be a peace.
And I think we're all going to get a link to that.
Point number 4. This is the deputinization. Deputinization means not kill the Putin. Please don't. We should cut any Putin and Russian influence in our own countries, in US, in Europe, for NGO, for the mass media, for everything. Stop for financing doing this dirty money, for corrupt our bureaucrats and our politicians. Stop doing that. And point number 5, or maybe point number 1, maybe the most disputable for some of them, but please believe, without that, nothing happened. We have here the session about what security are now. Very important question, Peter. Anybody think that this is the Security Council of the United Nations? Not anymore, because the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council is an aggressor. It is not working. It is a ruined post-war security system. Any other? No. One instrument. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. How we can settle that? Immediately. Do the same like you do with Sweden and with Finland. Give Ukraine membership in NATO, because NATO needs Ukraine even more than Ukraine needs NATO. Not everybody applauds. I think, and why it's important? Because last year...
Quickly, because I want to get to the audience. So
yeah, give me the film there, who is not applauded. And last year, Peter, remember, I sit exactly on this place. And here was Karamurza. You remember, he was moderator of my communication. And my message exactly 1 year ago was, you still have a chance to avoid the full-size aggression of Russia. 2 recommendations I said 1 year ago. Weapons, immediately give the weapons that Putin understands that we can stop them. And sanction. And this is the only chance how to avoid an aggression. If we don't give weapons and not introduce the sanction, that would be an aggression. Please, see my speech. Not everybody listened that. Same like not everybody today listen and applauding for NATO. Today, this is 3 recommendations. Again, weapon. Again, sanction. And NATO. Bravo.
All right, let's go to the go to the audience here. I see a microphone on this side. So anyone over here first, and then I'll turn to the other side. No, okay. So I see a microphone as well, and I see a hand. Yeah, right there. Right there. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We all have enormous respect for the country who is saving the world.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Leila Alieva. Now I came from the UK, but originally from Baku, Azerbaijan. So we met before. So my question is, are you too optimistic, maybe, saying that the world has changed after this war? Europe has already gone through similar situations. and it did change. It created EU and other things, but it repeats all the time, right? What makes you more optimistic this time and say that the world has changed? Do you think the lessons will be learned?
And quick answer, if you could, because we got to get to more questions as well. Sorry.
Okay. And the second question, do you think that probably regional capacities were not used to a sufficient degree? Remember, there was Guam. Maybe if there was enough investment, then maybe Russia would not dare doing that, probably because of the threat of resistance of 4 armies.
Quick answer, please, sir.
Am I optimist or not? Believe me, you cannot win the war if you are not optimist, if you are not believing your own victory. That's why when I have no army, no money, and have some embargo from the Western states for Ukraine when I was elected as the president, I don't have one tiny moment when I have any doubts about our victory. Because truth is with us, God is with us, and we have a fantastic nation. Am I optimist now? Yes. And on 24th of February, I go to office, take weapons together with thousands of Ukrainian people and go on the front line with the weapons in the hands to stop Russia. And I am optimistic about our victory, no doubt about that. Because we have absolutely different motivation from Russia. We protecting our values, our families, our children, and our soil, and our country, and our European choice. Russia has anything like that. Am I optimistic about the post-war structure? Less optimistic. And that's why, despite of the war, we should provide the reform. That's why we're demanding for the candidate status for the EU. And we're waiting the same for NATO. The rule of law, the freedom of press, the human rights, all the democratic instruments, we can win this war only if we can keep the democracy, not switch to the autocracy. And this is the great victory, because all the autocratic world think that they are stronger than the democratic free world. And in Ukraine, we demonstrate they are wrong. And democracy will win.
Jane Harmon. As you know, I was on the Maidan with Madeleine Albright in 2014 and part of the observer delegation to your fair and free election. One of the concerns then, and it remains, is the level of corruption in Ukraine, especially in the Rada and some other parts. I think that's a concern now of some in terms of giving aid for the future and in terms of your membership in NATO and EU. I'd just like you to address what is happening to reduce and hopefully eliminate the level of corruption in Ukraine.
Look, first of all, we know each other very well. I remember your visit with Madeleine Albright, and that was great to be in the Maidan and to have a free and fair election. Both elections, which I was responsible in here, 2014 and 2019, was brilliant from the democratic point of view. And about the corruption, before the 24th of February, I was the leader of the opposition. Now we are united, no opposition, until our victory. And I should criticize the government about the corruption. I should mention that during my process of the reform, we create absolutely independent National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Special Anti-Corruption Prosecution Office, the Electronic Declaration for Fighting Corruption, many of them. Here we have our activists for the non-corruption organization. They're doing a great job here. But my message, we definitely should fight the corruption even during the war. But I hate the idea when we're speaking about the corruption in general, this is the wrong thing. We should speak particularly every single case and monitoring that, delivering them till the court and the prison. Please, let's switch to this model, and that brings a success.
One last quick question, one last quick answer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Scotty Greenwood, Washington, D.C. Let's assume that we all take every single one of your recommendations and do all of that. What is your advice about China? Because we know that Putin and Xi are aligned and we're worried about China. Thank you.
Now I understand that U.S. paying lots of attention to China. Secretary Austin planned to go to the Southeast Asia. President Biden has on the main events on the G20 was not the meeting of 20, but meeting between Biden and Xi. I know President Biden very well. He's a great diplomat and demonstrates a unique leadership in the world, how to stop Putin aggression. Great diplomat. Because I spent with him many, many hours. He make a joke that some weeks he speak with me more often than with his wife. And I strongly count on him and trust him. I have a meeting with President Xi. I know that he is not Putin. And it's possible to reach an agreement. But again, please, the future of the world is deciding in Ukrainian soil now. Not on Taiwan, not on China, not on somebody else. We should concentrate the efforts and stop the cancer in the center of Europe because of the Putin aggression. We should deputinize the world. And when we deputinize the world, definitely, we can build up absolutely new type of relation with China, no doubt.
There are two people who wanted to be here during this weekend. That is Andrei Yermak, who is the equivalent of the Chief of Staff to President Zelensky, and Alexei Danilov, who is the equivalent of the National Security Advisor to President Zelensky. You heard from Yermak yesterday. Why don't we turn it over to Danilov right now?
Мужність українських солдат. Про те, що наші люди, сидячи під російськими обстрілами, без світла, води, зв'язку та їжі, як ніколи вірять в перемогу нашої країни. Про те, що українська держава, незважаючи на всі спроби Росії зламати її, продовжує функціонувати. Працює економіка, виконуються соціальні зобов'язання, живуть люди. Я скажу одне – перемога буде за нами. Для нас перемога – це не лише перемога у війні і повернення до кордонів 91-го року. Для нас є також важлива перемога в мірі. Для цього нам з нашими союзниками необхідно створити архітектуру стратегічних ініціатив під час перехідного періоду. Цей період після закінчення війни та перед початком системного відновлення нашої країни буде не менш складним. На цьому шляху нас чекають багато викликів – відновлення економіки, відновлення інфраструктури, відновлення зруйнованого довкілля, подолання гуманітарної кризи. Ми також не можемо допустити внутрішніх конфліктів в суспільстві та його радикалізацію, розколу в політичних елітах, адже без сумніву Російська Федерація не покине спробу розхитати нашу країну через гібридні атаки. Це завдання передбачатиме підтримку гарантій сталого миру для недопущення повторних агресій з боку Російської Федерації, притягнення Росії до відповідальності, євроінтеграцію та перехід до побудови України як передової європейської демократичної країни. Фундаментом для успішного проходження перехідного періоду є три складові – згуртоване суспільство, розбудова держави та інституційних спроможностей, встановлення верховенства права. Такі рамки перехідного періоду обумовлені потребами і запитами українського суспільства. Як показують опитування, українці як ніколи прагнуть встановлення повноцінного демократичного ладу, верховенства права, перехід від олігархічних та корупційних практик. Потужним є запит на відновлення гідності та справедливості. У питанні необхідності вступу до Євросоюзу та НАТО досягнуто національний консенсус. Ці запити і потреби мають стати базовою для функціональної держави та взаємодії між суспільством та владою. Основою успішного проходження України цього складного періоду є посилення спроможності державних інституцій. Перед нами стоїть непросте питання. Необхідно знайти баланс між глибокою трансформацією державних інституцій та безперебійним виконанням критичних функцій держави. І все це в вкрай складних умовах, коли обмежені всі види ресурсів. Рух до членства в Євросоюз для нас є неймовірною підтримкою на цьому шляху. Він створює орієнтири для впровадження стандартів державного управління. Це стандарти засновані на взаємно інтегрованих політиках і підході цілісного уровня, на забезпечення прозорості, підзвітності влади, верховенства права. Виконання держави критичних функцій також важливе і для підтримки та посилення рівня згуртованості суспільства. Українське суспільство виявило свою ініціативність, принциповість, здатність до самоорганізації та побудови і використання горизонтальних зв'язків. Це є потужним стратегічним капіталом в нашої країни, який необхідно зберегти та максимально посилити. І це може бути гарним прикладом для всіх демократичних країн, чиє суспільство також може бути мішенню для Російської Федерації. Ці процеси мають бути включені всі громадяни нашої країни. Ми будемо рухатись далі, розбудовуючи українську політичну націю. Вона вже будується навколо спільної візії майбутнього нашої країни, як мирної, сильної, безпечної та процвітаючої країни. Для підтримки розбудови нації нам необхідно створити політики, які будуть сприяти вільному розвитку української культури та культури національних меншин, формування спільної політики пам'яті, реінтеграції українців, яких дуже багато розкинуто по світу. Такі політики також мають забезпечити вільний розвиток особистості, забезпечення прав та свобод людини. Всі ці кроки будуть ставати поштовхом для економічного розвитку і політичної стабілізації, що зробить Україну надійним союзником. Найголовніше, вони стануть запорукою сталого миру. Дякую за увагу, дякую за честь виступити на форумі в Галіфаксі. Слава Україні!
Guarantees for Ukrainian security, and Ukraine as a model for other democracies. That's the message. President Poroshenko, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to the Peter, and thanks to all of you. And I have a proposal to Peter. Maybe next year we can have a Halifax Security Forum in Yalta, or in Sevastopol, or in Simferopol. That would be a great idea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we make this short transition. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Take your seats, please. The program begins now.
Right, I enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure how to start because I don't think I've ever been trolled before at the beginning of a session, but the BBC with its terrible predictions of climate change. I'm Jamie Kumarasamy, by the way. I am a presenter, host for BBC Radio, and I hadn't seen that before. Peter keeps these things a closely guarded secret. But I do know John Hammond, the guy that featured in that, he actually works for the BBC now. He's a meteorologist. He's also a newsreader. We often share a studio together. I will see him in about 3 days' time in the studio. I can tell him he was the star, one of the stars of the Halifax Security Forum. This is a wonderful occasion. First of all, let me thank Peter and everyone for the invitation. I think this is now my 5th Halifax, and I feel part of the family, which I think in conversations over the last couple of days, it really is a family here. Peter's done such a great job of, as well as bringing a great array of guests from government, from think tanks, from all over the world, but actually to create this place where we can have interesting, stimulating discussions like this, I hope, but also to see friends, make new friends. So a big thanks to Peter and the team for doing such a great job. For understandable reasons, the main focus of this weekend has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war, a war of choice, a war for territory, a war with existential implications for the people of Ukraine. But this session is dedicated to an issue which, as we saw in that video, spans the world and does have existential implications for all of us, and that's climate change. The title refers to water, and water, of course, is the most visual, the most tangible manifestation of how our world is warming and the impacts that we all feel as a result of it. These extreme events linked, and no one doubts the linkage. You might debate to what extent they are caused by, but certainly linked to our warming planet. And as we saw there, this year has seen some incredibly extreme, we call them extreme, they're becoming more and more, sadly, run-of-the-mill events, but still extreme nonetheless. The worst floods in 500 years, worst heat wave, should I say, in Europe in 500 years. That's according to the EU's Copernicus Environmental Institute. And as well as having dry rivers, countries have had terrible problems with the heat in terms of the impacts on health, but the rivers have had an impact on transportation, agriculture. In France, for example, nuclear power plants unable to get the water they need to be cooled. And then, of course, we've had the drought in the Horn of Africa, which has led to, 20 million people facing starvation, 7 million children facing malnutrition, killing livestock, killing livelihoods, displacing large numbers of people, and we'll talk about that during this panel. And then places like Pakistan having the opposite issue, the problem of flooding, which in Pakistan's case took in a third or so of the country. I think in a North America analogy, at one province, Sindh, the flood waters covered an area of the state of Virginia. Nigeria, Australia, the list goes on, Chad, Honduras. Basically, climate change and its impacts are here and are in our face. And for this discussion, we have 3 people who are going to address various aspects of it. Now, I want this, excuse this pun because I'm prone to them, I do want this to be free-flowing as a conversation. I want to bring you all in as soon as possible, but I do want to start with our 3 panelists, starting... in fact, 3 panelists who are a trio of acronyms, I would say. We've got MEME, not that sort. We've got HIAS, and we've got COVE. So we've got 3 different acronyms. which will help us anchor where we are. I'll start with meme. Dalia Aziada is an expert on international security. That's her field of study. She's from Egypt. She works between Egypt and the United States. And meme stands for her Center for Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean Studies, of which she's the executive director. Next along, we have Mark Hetfield, who is president of HIAS. HIAS stands for Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which tells you about the origin of this humanitarian organization, but not about its global reach now. 27 countries you're working in?
22.
22. Say 27. 22 countries. It's a humanitarian organization, works with refugees, works with people who are forced to migrate for a whole variety of reasons, but one of them certainly is our changing climate. And last but not least, our local panel member, Melanie Nadeau. So appropriate that her name has a French word for water in it. I'm sure you all speak French, so think about it. She's the CEO of COVE, which is a Centre for Ocean Ventures and Entrepreneurship based here in Halifax. She is someone with a naval background, was in the Canadian Royal Navy, an engineer by training as well, and works now on sustainable innovation, on solutions. So very much a solutions based person on our panel, looking at how to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And we'll talk about some of the sort of innovative work she's involved with here as well. But perhaps having introduced you, I'll get you to slightly introduce yourself as well, and maybe a question, because we are talking about climate change on the day, or just after, the COP27 conference has wrapped up, appropriately enough, in Egypt, in your home country, Dalia, and you were there right at the beginning of COP27 for the youth part of it. I don't know if I've spoken to a couple of people here who managed to combine COP27 with Halifax as well, so I don't know if there's anyone who's been at COP, but welcome any contributions on your thoughts. That esteemed media outlet, the BBC, has just posed a question, I see, on its website. Is this the most successful or the least successful COP since Paris? I mean, what would you say has come out of this? Because on the one hand, there are some positives, notably on this question of loss and damage and commitments to countries which feel that they have contributed little to climate change but have been forced to bear the brunt of its impact. And we've seen an interesting rapprochement, if that's not too strong a word, between the United States and China, at least talking again about climate change after some time when they were not talking. But on the actual issue of climate change, the initial verdict seemed to be actually very little movement has happened since COP26 in Glasgow. So I wonder what your thoughts are.
So actually, first of all, good morning. I'm happy to be here as always. It's a very interesting question, whether COP27 is the most successful or the least successful is two extremes. So I will try to stop in the middle and say that it was appropriately successful on both the official and the non-official levels. On the non-official level, for a while now in Egypt, I'm sure you've been noticing that we did not have this space of free speech, people protesting and expressing themselves. So it was nice to see that happening. And it opened the space somehow, put some kind of pressure that allowed for activists to appear again and to be liked again by the popular basis after long years of being actually stigmatized or being called agents to the West. But now people are seeing they are advocating for issues that very much relate to them. On the official level, yes, it was successful. And I think the success, the best thing that came out of this conference is the fact that for the first time, maybe unlike all the previous climate change conferences on that level, we can see there is some kind of solidarity and understanding between the global north and the global south. It's not anymore the global north is doing the mistake of polluting the world and the global south is suffering the consequences of this mistake. Now all of us are suffering the consequences of climate change, the food security issues, the energy security, the energy crisis, even the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war, which all of us are suffering either from the global south or the global north. And this was beautifully translated into what we have seen, the loss and damage fund. And the best thing about it is the goal of the fund, for the first time, uses the word to protect rather than to compensate. The goal is to protect the vulnerable developing countries against the adverse effects of climate change. In all the previous calls for making such a fund, there was always a call to compensate the developing countries for the mistakes of the industrial wealthy countries. So this shows how this solidarity is beautifully translated into this action. Also, actually, we have seen several world leaders coming together, maybe in contexts they wouldn't be in normal life or in normal cases, which also allowed the opening of discussions on other levels, like not only about climate issues, but also social, trade, business, and even political issues.
Okay, so an upbeat assessment from you. I'm going to go over to Melanie, perhaps, because you've been involved in COPs in the past, haven't you? You've seen the process close up. What's your assessment?
Well, it's hard to say if this has been a good or a bad COP. And in fact, the conversations are still happening as we're here today. But I think the important thing to note is the discussion and the dialogue that is happening amongst global leaders, and the side conversations. So the point that there is positive that happens in sidebar conversations, and that's what that event is really important for. I've been involved in advising the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for a long time. And when you think about what that panel, and those are international scientists from all over the world, top of their game, who are advising leaders about what the impact of climate change is going to have and how quickly it's going to progress. And so if you think about, where these conversations started, you might remember the Kyoto Protocol over 20 years ago. And that's where we first started talking about climate change, and the dialogue began. And the IPCC was saying there's warmth that's happening to this planet caused by human behavior, and which we were all trying to understand. And then that dialogue continued. My concern is, though, so we'll see how these discussions continue, but my concern is there's talk. With the Paris Agreement, there was a decision to go to let's not increase more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's discussion right now that maybe that's not the right number. It should be higher. And that's a goal for the end of the century, to not increase by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So
that's going backwards.
It is going backwards. And the thing that we've seen over 20 years is that we keep moving the needle. We are acting on changing the needle in the opposite direction. And I think, that's where I get concerned. That's where, people who've been working in this space for a long time are challenged by that. So I think that's really important. And the other point that somebody was surfaced in the conversations we've been having here, and the question was asked, is how do you prevent a war? Well, you just don't become complacent. And it's the same thing from a climate change point of view. We cannot become complacent. So even though the needle of the targets are moving, us as organizations, industry, investors, advocates, we cannot become complacent, even though the target keeps changing, and maybe not in the direction that it should. So I think that's important to remember, and that's why the sidebar conversations that happen in these big meetings are very, very important. And the last thing that I will say, again, I don't, the new fund is very good news. I don't know yet all the positives that are going to come out of COP27, but one of the things that I think that was very positive with COP26 was the financial alliance that was established. And these are financiers, these are banks that were set up to focus on net zero. And that's really, really important. And this is not about the 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is about investors who have trillions of assets that they manage all over the world, and they can make a difference. And they can make a difference where they are going to invest, what they're not going to go and invest in. And I think that is a really tremendous outcome that happened with COP26. Now the challenge is you've got to make sure that you continue, you implement, and you continue in that vision of net zero, but those are the things that do make a big difference.
So when it comes to those side conversations, are they really the main event in some aspects? Because one of the criticisms, and it's being made sort of this one certainly, is that business and other stakeholders, yes, they are involved and they are very much there in the discussions, but actually when the decisions are made, it's still on a governmental level. And as a sort of someone who's in private sector, looking at private sector solutions, do you believe that the private sector is playing a sufficient role, or does have a kind of key role in this?
Well, I'll go back to the investors. I think that there is still a great lack of investment that is going towards finding the solutions to help support the transition that will aim to reduce the impacts of climate change. So, and the private sector does have a big role to that, as does the government. So the government can help de-risk. The government can provide a lot of clarity. So when there's rules that are changing, that's also a very uncertain investment scenario. So when the rules are changing or the needle moves in the direction you didn't think it was going to, well, that creates a very uncertain investment climate. So whether you're in government, you're in industry, you're in financing or whatnot. And so government has a role to play in providing a level of certainty around the future so that investment, entrepreneurs, et cetera, can start figuring out how to solve these major problems that we have related to climate change.
Thanks. Mark, let's bring you in because we're looking at the impact of climate change. People is somehow will be a consequence of the way our planet is changing. But I wonder to what extent, from your experience, do you think it is happening now?
Right, Jamie. Climate change, climate migration is not something we have to prepare for because it's already here. It's too late to prepare. We now have to address it. The official number I've heard is that 20 million people per year are already being displaced due to climate change. I frankly think that is a very lowball estimate. 70% of the world's 105 million refugees and forcibly displaced persons today come from the most vulnerable countries to climate change. And they migrate not just because of natural disasters, although that's one reason, not just because their countries may soon be submerged by water, which is another reason, but because the land where they live, you can no longer live on it. It's too hot. You can no longer grow crops on it. You can no longer raise livestock on it. So they have to move. And the problem with the way countries are acting, governments are acting, especially those governments that produce the most greenhouse gases, is that they're not addressing the causes of climate migration. They're not addressing climate migration. They're addressing climate migrants. So governments are investing a lot of money in migration management, in keeping the migrants out of their country, rather than acting collectively that these people who are fleeing for their lives have a place to go, or better yet, that they don't have to flee at all. And part of the problem, and like so many other things we talk about at Halifax, is that the entire international framework for addressing migration, for addressing refugees, was written in the context of the Second World War. It was written in 1951 to address displacement in Europe from the Second World War. It has not been updated since. And these are not people who are fleeing because of their race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion, but they are fleeing for their lives. And they have no right to flee if you're fleeing starvation, if you're fleeing just to live. So this has to be addressed.
What would the forum for that be?
Well, I mean, the forum, and I have to say, the good news, if there is any good news, is that it's being talked about a lot. And it's talked about in the compact on migration that was passed overwhelmingly by the General Assembly. It's talked about in the compact on refugees. But it's a lot of talk. And you can have all the talk you want in the United Nations, but you have to have states taking action. And without states taking action, this is not going to get any better. And I'll also say that in terms of COP27, there was one passing mention of migrants in the final document. So it's not being talked about there, at least not enough.
Right. Dalia, what about in the region? I mean, the other aspect, of course, of water, and it's particularly relevant to Egypt, is the potential for conflict, the potential to argue about access to water. Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Nile is potential flashpoint. Where are we with things? Where are we with that?
Actually, it's interesting. Like the title of our session is H2O, which is refers to water, which I think will be the next global crisis in the series of crises that we are going through after the energy crisis and the food crisis. Sooner or later, we will see again the autocratic countries are trying to deprive or practice, weaponize water as a tool to pressure other countries to submit to them, as we have been seeing Russia weaponizing food and energy. So far, China is already doing this with its neighbors, weaponizing water to influence them and affect their future and security. In Egypt, the case is a little bit different. I hope, God forbid, we never get to the point of a military conflict about it, but it's seriously an international security issue, this conflict that's happening around the Nile River. It's not only an African issue, it's not only an issue related to East Africa alone, because every time Egypt and Sudan try to approach the international community to intervene in this issue and try to come with a solution, it's always pushed away by saying it's not a European issue, it's not a Western issue, it's not a global issue, it's only an African issue. And every time we go back to the African Union, we unfortunately don't get to any results. For decades now, actually, more than a decade, but it has been going on, the negotiation has been going on for decades about not like the Ethiopians are promoting. It's not about depriving them from their sovereign right to build dams or to do whatever they want on their lands, but simply to sign a binding agreement with Egypt and Sudan that guarantees Egypt and Sudan are the downstream countries of the river. So they want to sign an agreement with Ethiopia to guarantee their right in the water Nile and thus guarantee their own water security. Marco was talking about the huge number of immigrants and refugees. It's really shocking, and I don't want to see this happening in my country, Egypt, because actually some of the farmers who, especially in the northern cities, northern urban cities, started to think about this from now. The idea of if the Nile stopped running up to our farms, we will simply think about crossing the Mediterranean to the other side, to Europe, which will again renew the crisis of illegal immigration, which Egypt has been successfully controlling for about 5 years or 7 years even now. So we don't want to see this happening again, and I hope the Nile River conflict will be taken care of by the international community before it's too late.
Melanie, what about solutions? Because you work on solutions, don't you, for both monitoring how the climate's changing, underwater, overwater. Tell us, give us some hope.
Yeah, there is good news. There is good news. So you know, we talked about food security yesterday, and I live in the tech space, so even when we look at fishing and seafood, which is a really important protein for the world, there's a lot of waste right now that happens. And this is we've got to change the way that we're doing things today. And so there's about 10 million metric tons of waste that gets produced from the catch of the fish to plate. And so there's really interesting ways to reduce that waste. And just to give you a sense, that's like over 4,500 Olympic swimming pools of food, of high protein food that could feed a lot of people. So there's a lot of things right now that are happening around that from a tech point of view. One is looking at imaging and artificial intelligence to reduce the bycatch, as an example, so that it is the high protein that you're actually catching and that you're not impacting the biodiversity. The other thing that's also really quite interesting, a tech that right now that's out there is ropeless fishing gear, which is quite big all over the world. And that's twofold really interesting because it reduces this issue of bycatch and waste, as an example, with ropeless fishing gear, but it also reduces, from an environmental point of view, the plastics that are largely attributed to fishing around the world that end up in our oceans. So about 70%, 60 to 70% of the microplastics that are in the ocean are associated with fishing gear. And microplastics, the reason that they're important is because they're consumed by fish, by different species, and they're also very difficult to collect. And so that's really important as well. The other thing that I wanted to mention, because I've also been involved in electric vehicles for 20 years, believe it or not, but we're seeing, we're talking about China, so China is one of the major manufacturers of electric vehicles and really has a very strong supply chain, one of the world's most strong supply chain electric vehicles. The interesting thing as we're moving towards electrification globally, which is a good thing, it's part of our path to decarbonization, is that we do have some challenges that are coming very quickly around that, and one related to batteries. So lithium that is being mined in certain countries of the world, there's a forecast right now that the lithium that we have currently planned with the electrification plans that are happening in China and other parts of the world, that's going to start to stave off around 2027, 2030. So that's coming up very quickly. So we need to start thinking about either how we're going to mine more lithium in other parts of the world. There's an opportunity to mine lithium from the bottom of the ocean where there is actually a lot of lithium. But then that's a whole other conversation about deep sea mining, which I don't know that we have time to talk about here. But just to talk about solutions again, so if that's the case on lithium, and lithium is going to be it's a very important mineral for the world from a battery point of view, we've got to also start working on other solutions. So one of the other options for lithium battery is sodium-ion batteries. And sodium-ion batteries comes from salt water. It's salt. Essentially, it's not that simple, but essentially that's where sodium comes from. And we have an abundance with the ocean of salt. So those are the type of things that we really need to start working on, and working at a much quicker pace, I would say, than we have been historically.
And Mark, you were saying that the world has not been prepared or has seen this migration crisis as a result of climate change happen without the structures in place to deal with it. I mean, in terms of mitigation from the refugee point of view, are there things that could be done?
Well, I mean, the most important thing to do is to make sure that the temperature doesn't rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? That will address the root cause, but as I said, it's already happening. And so we have to take seriously our obligations, at least to the 1951 Refugee Convention. If we can't even address that, we can't address climate migration. And the number of refugees is growing every year. Right now, it's at the highest number in human history. Because states are not trying to find solutions for refugees. And my first year at Halifax was in 2015, where I was hoping the lesson was being learned that refugees do not present a localized problem. Right? It is an international problem, and Europe learned that the hard way in 2015 when the Syrian refugee crisis came to Europe. Right? But apparently we still have not yet learned that lesson, and we continue to focus on migrants rather than migration, and that focus has to change.
And Dalia, you've touched on this a bit, but I wonder in terms of the global geopolitical situation, the war in Ukraine, the fact that it has led to some countries rowing back on certain green obligations or thinking about energy security, and that's changed the dynamic a bit. To what extent do you feel that it's overshadowing efforts to decarbonize?
Actually, yeah, unlike, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war is so tragic, and most of the countries of the world has condemned this war, but I don't know, somehow I can see a bright side coming out of this war in terms ways that it's pushing certain actors on the global stage to work together in a ways that they have never been working together before. Look, for example, at the water crisis I was just speaking about a moment ago, how it's encouraging both countries like Egypt and Israel to come together to cooperate on energy issues, exporting natural gas to Europe, and also cooperating on issues related to the distillation of water. Israel is very advanced in this technology, distillation technology, and Egypt went to it to ask, how can we use your technology, or how you can help us with your advanced technology to improve our ability to distillize water. And they are cooperating on this now. Recently also, speaking about the grain and the grain deal and all the issues that has been going around, we started to see better cooperation between the Mediterranean countries in terms with looking for ways to store the grains and to improve even their agricultural capabilities in order to satisfy their needs. So this kind of cooperation, I think, is the best thing that's coming out of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Also, if it would be good if, I always like to use this metaphor, we are now seeing some kind of mobilization between mobilization of the arsenal of democracy against the arsenal of autocracy. And it's because of this Russia-Ukraine war. And it's definitely in the best interest of the arsenal of democracy to attract more and more people to its side. And the more and more countries that are willing, really, unlike, of course, what we are seeing in media all the time, all these conflicts and talks about different perspectives about issues like human rights, for example, between the countries of the Middle East and the United States. But I believe most of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region are really willing to join the arsenal of democracy. It only needs the leaders of the arsenal of democracy to be very careful about how to approach them, to reach them, to encourage them to join their parades, and also to be understanding to their needs. And by the way, I don't want my words to be misunderstood in any way, because some people recently were trying to say that for the United States to attract Middle Eastern countries to its side, it has to stop talking about issues like human rights and democratization. But in fact, no. On the contrary, the talk about democratization, encouraging the process of democratization has always should always remain part of the conversation between the West, or the leaders of the arsenal of democracy, and the countries of the Middle East that are willing to do this. So I think it should be on the agenda next year.
Okay, well, we've sort of moved, I guess, past our agenda for this hour, so I think that's probably a good time to throw the conversation to the audience. If anyone's got a couple of questions. So, lady over there.
Thank you so much. Solange Marquez, I'm from Mexico. The question is for Mark. And after COP27, they agreed a fund for states to help them to rise up after all the consequences of climate change. But small island states face the threat of not exist in the long future. So how are we going to address them? Because during COP27, they said, okay, we will give you money, but that money is not going to help me to find another place and soil to start a new state. So what we are going to do with that?
You're right, and the only solution is migration. There's only a migration solution to that, quite obviously. And the international community, or the states that make up the international community, can't keep being ostriches and put their heads in the sand and solve that problem with money alone. You're right, there needs to be an agreement as to how that's going to be addressed.
John.
Thank you very much. My name is John Glenn. I'm with the National Endowment for Democracy, and I want to say how pleased I am to see the conversation about water and climate in our security context, but it's in that context that I'd like to ask the three panelists to share with us your assessment of China's participation in COP27. Within the security conversation, we often have a principled statement about we'll compete where we must and cooperate where we can. And while I share that vision, it's a vision that's proven very difficult to implement with China, which often exists on linkages between how we behave in one area and how they do in another. I've been following somewhat. I'm personally pleased that the US and China have agreed to resume conversations about it, but I'd be interested in your assessment of either China's at the COP27 or what you would hope that they could contribute to this conversation and this challenge.
We'd like to take that on first. Melanie, maybe?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt from a climate point of view that China has to be part of the conversation. You know, China, when you look at just the energy landscape, it's about 50% of their energy now is renewable. And they are a powerful country in terms of technology that they're developing, and they're bypassing a lot of countries like the US and others in their not only deployment, but also their technology advantage that they're experiencing. So I think it would be remiss if we don't figure out how to work with China on solving this global challenge that we really have around climate change. So good, what's the good and the bad of COP27? I think the good is the US and China are in conversation, as you pointed out. I think that seems very positive.
Yeah, that's a hard question, and one I think a lot about. Again, I see it strictly through a migration lens where I sit, and large autocracies like China and Russia are not good homes for refugees and for displaced persons, right? And so the role that they can play in that regard is rather limited, but they have to be held to account for their treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, including climate migrants. And they have to be held to account for creating refugees, such as the Uyghurs from China. There's a lot of work for the international community to do on that front.
So I think actually China is part of the problem, not part of the conversation somehow. So I think it's, for example, in Africa, China is the largest investor, but also one of the largest polluters of Africa. So we have, in general, a problem in the international community about this issue of accountability, how to hold certain countries accountable for what they are doing, hurting other countries on all levels, not only on the climate level, but also on the political levels and other levels. So when we get to a point on how to hold countries accountable for what they do regarding climate, I think at that time we'll be able to force China and other countries on the autocratic arsenal again, who would not listen otherwise.
Force.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Force.
Okay, we'll see how that works out. Helen's got a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the work that you're doing. Just to start on a positive point, I think the fact that the COP27 took place on the African continent is a very good signal. However, we have this feeling of a glass half empty at the end of every COP that takes place. And is it not the case that whatever announcement is made, and I think the main one will be the creation of a fund, is that none of these measures are constraining? And my question is simple. What will it take for governments and the international community to invest in prevention rather than in reaction and fixing up the damages, which today starts costing far more than the investment that will be needed in renewable energies, in indeed preventing immigration with the destabilization of democracies. Today we have just a few thousand people crossing the Mediterranean, but in the future there may be millions of them going up north, trying to simply have a normal and decent life for their families. So,
I don't know, is that maybe one for you, Melanie?
Sure. I mean, it's a very, very hard question because we've been working at it for so long, right? I mean, even here in Halifax, so we had our most expensive storm that just happened a few weeks ago. It was post-tropical storm Fiona, and that's been our most expensive storm on record that we've had here. So, and we had the military involved in that, so the military was engaged in that. That is happening all over the world, and it's going to start happening very, very closely. So we need a lot of education for people, because they see a crisis, we move on, and then you forget about it. And then it happens again, you forget about it. So we need to engage in the conversation with governments, but also people. And people are going to be solving this challenge. It's probably not going to be the governments. The governments will set a target, a direction. They will invest, but I think people are going to make the change to try to get to a point where we're not increasing past 1.5 degrees Celsius. And people are going to be demanding, youth are going to be demanding it. And this is what's interesting around climate, because youth are having an increasingly bigger voice. And that is going to change how the dynamic of the conversation over time, because I think they're just not going to accept it. And at some point, and it's already happening, and I know you were there, but it's already happening that youth are having such a loud voice. And it's interesting when I was hearing about, we were talking about the Ukraine last night, and you know, it is a younger generation that is going to rebuild Ukraine. And they're digitizing Ukraine. It's going to be completely different. And youth are going to have a big say in what's going to happen next. And I think in climate, they're going to have an even bigger say. And so why do I care? I care because I've got a five-year-old son. And I want my son in 20 years and 30 years to be not saying, Mom, why didn't you do anything about it? And I think that's going to be the message to a lot of people. It's going to hit home. At some point, it's going to hit home. And then individually, as people, we're going to take stronger and stronger action. So not an answer to your question, but it is a hard question.
Yeah, and sorry, I was remiss not asking actually, when you asked your question, if you wouldn't mind standing up and identifying yourself. I think down here was the next person.
I was hoping I could sit down, James.
Sorry.
Nancy Southern, CEO and Chair of ATCO. I really just have an observation, and I'd love you to comment on it. What's striking me about this panel, which I think has been terrific, is the world taking a bit of a siloed approach to ESG. And it seems to me that a more holistic approach to ESG should be understood and actually worked on, and perhaps even add a few of letters to the acronym. Perhaps economic, EE, security and social, defense and governance, which what you're talking about really is impacting and touching every aspect of what we talk about here in Halifax and all of our worlds. So I want to thank you all for enlightening me and providing me with this observation of what we're talking about too often is a siloed approach.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Let's have a look. At the back, a hand up.
Good morning. I'm Lincoln Bloomfield from Washington. Thank you for your comments. I'd like to come back to the film that we've seen, which are incidents which have already happened, and the 1.5 degrees Celsius and timelines. And I'd like to ask the panelists this question. We hear what we're going to get done by 2050 and what we're going to get done by 2040. And the tendency of average people is to say, well, we'll get serious about it at 2035 or 2045. We have a deadline coming up, we better run faster. And there's a tendency to say, well, the government will take care of it. My challenge to the panelists is, tell us what we can do between right now and 2030 at the citizen level all over the world. What can everyone at the Halifax Security Forum go home and tell everyone they know to do right now? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mark, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, first of all, we all have to set an example, right? And so all of us are looking at our own carbon footprint. You know, the NGO sector, the international organizations are all looking at our own carbon footprint and urging states to do the same and to act immediately because it is an emergency. As I said, climate change, it's not coming, it's already here. We have a 100-year storm every year now.
Dalia.
I have a quick comment. Actually, thank you for bringing up the power of the people, because I think we, the ordinary people, are the actual game changer here, not the decision makers. Decision makers' hands are always tied by elections, by their own policies, by many things. So it's good you brought up the issue of the power of the people. What should we be doing from now until 2030? Or even beyond? There are certain plans that has been put on place, but first of all is that we have to educate the public that climate issues are not a luxury, are not something that comes after the other crises we're facing. It's an urgent crisis that we have to immediately deal with. And regarding the long-term plan, and this also has to deal with Ellen's question, I think there are certain statistics that could give us a guideline on how to proceed from the COP. The first of which is an action plan that Africa came up with before COP27 to have 25, the plan is for Africa Acceleration Adaptation Program, and they are asking for $25 billion over the next 5 years. Of course, countries has promised since 29 to provide funds for the acceleration of the adaptation, especially in Africa. For example, in 29, there were promises about funding about $100 billion per year for the next 20 years, until 2020. This never happened, by the way. These were only promises. So maybe it's time now to mobilize as people and pressure our governments, or try to find even ways to fundraise amongst each other to combat this. So this is one of the plans that we may follow on.
Melanie, one thing.
Well, I think we need to, just take an example in the VC space, talk about solutions. There are solutions in the market, and there's going to be more solutions, because this whole energy transition period is complex. And there will be continuously different solutions over time that will be developed that will be better and better and better. But talking about the VC space for a sec, the VC space, so the venture capital space, which invests in businesses, new ideas, people, only is between 2 and 3% of investments are made into female-led companies. So what does that mean? That means that females are not part of the solution. So then if you look at other groups, other underrepresented groups, it gets lower and lower, and in fact, the stats, we can't even capture the stats on that. And so, we need to be thinking about solutions and engaging different people in the conversations and different people to drive the solutions. And I think, if there's one thing you could do, you could say, make sure that people at the table look very different to come up with the answers that we need to solve these big problems.
Great. Well, time for one final question. I think that the hand was slightly first, so gentleman here. There's a...
Hi, Daryl Bricker from Ipsos. So we do global public opinion research. I ask about climate change every month. 30 countries, we just put out a new poll. We got another one coming out, 29 countries. Climate change, on a list of 18 issues, most important issue facing you, the one that you're most concerned about, any month, 8 to 10. When we ask people what they're prepared to do for climate change, the answer is basically nothing. So where's the failure here? I mean, we can't come off a allegedly successful COP27. We've been talking, banging on about this. We've got people gluing themselves to paintings and galleries. None of it seems to be cutting through. Where's the failure? In terms of bringing the public on side with this.
Yeah, it's a big one. I don't know who wants to take that one on briefly.
I think the failure is that there are other things that are taking the priority right now. And the talk about climate change is happening at the time when the world is having many crises. The war is happening in Eastern Europe. People are not sure about their own food security. So all of these factors together make, and even issues related to human rights, and so all of these factors make climate change seem very small next to them. That's
despite what we're seeing.
Of course, it's very important. But so I think it's about education, educating the public about the importance of the issue.
Mark, I don't really want to end on failure, but that's the way we've come to. But what?
Well, it goes to the question: what can we do right now, right, between now and 2030? And that's what we have to do. Is we have to. I hate to say it, but we have to scare the daylights out of people. Like, instead of making migrants the boogeyman, maybe we should make climate change the boogeyman, because that is what's going to ruin us all if we don't address it. Every single person is going to be affected.
Very briefly, Melanie.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question because I don't understand. I don't know why, but I do think that when you're thinking about, well, two things. When you're thinking about youth, and youth are our future, they care. And I hope that they care in 20 years and 30 years where we've sort of just been complacent. You know, it's an issue of the next 2 decades. It's an issue that's so far down the road that it's very hard for people to say, well, I can push that off because I've got food security. I can push that off because there's something else going on. So I don't know the answer, but we've got to close in that gap. And I believe in youth because I talk to them and they want to have impact. They want to have impact, and they need to be telling everyone else how to do that.
A call to arms, positive end.
Yeah.
This conversation will continue, but this particular one wraps up right now. So thanks everyone for contributing. Many thanks to the panel.
Please join us for coffee and exhibits in the foyer. The program will resume promptly.
I'll start again. Peter, I hope that wasn't a metaphor, the caged animals, for all of us being together in the same hotel for 3 days. I am Ken Wallach. I'm chairman of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. And before my retirement from a day job, I was president of the National Democratic Institute for nearly 3 decades, where we were fortunate to benefit from Peter's talent in some challenging environments overseas. And NDI's loss was Halifax's gain. This conference rightfully describes itself as the leading security meeting for democracies. It is therefore fitting that our concluding plenary session is dedicated to this linkage. By the way of introduction, I'll just say that efforts to advance democracy has, in recent years and in certain circles, become an issue of some debate. Paradoxically, it is seen as too bellicose, conflated with regime change and military force, or too soft or idealistic as a response to serious security threats. The real issue, however, is not whether democracy promotion is hard or soft, or fits neatly into the realism or idealism paradigm. The issue is whether advancing democracy is a means of advancing our collective interests and protecting our security. And I think the answer is yes. We have learned a few things about the relationship between democracy and security. First, regimes that brutalize their own citizens are more likely to act aggressively against their neighbors. This is certainly and tragically borne out by one-man rule in Russia and China. Second, that hotspots more likely to erupt in violence are found, for the most part, in areas of the world that are non-democratic, places where our Pentagon has defined as the arc of instability. These are places that experience ethnic conflict and civil war. They generate refugee flows across borders. I believe it was Secretary of Defense James Mattis who once said that people do not flee a free press. They harbor terrorists and they produce illegal drugs. And we know in this interconnected and interdependent world, what happens for good or for bad within borders of nations has regional and sometimes global impact. Contrary to that famous tagline in tourism marketing, what happens, let's say, in Kiev or Cairo or Wuhan or Damascus, in San Salvador or Tigray, doesn't stay there. If our ultimate foreign policy goal is a world that is secure, stable, humane, and safe, and where the risk of war is minimal, then our collective efforts to advance greater freedoms globally represent a convergence of our values and our interests. To address these and other issues, we are privileged to have 4 panelists from 4 regions of the world with very diverse experiences. They have lived through the rise and fall of democratic rule and have witnessed civil war, foreign aggression, violent extremism, humanitarian crises, and military coups. Collectively, they have been scientists, diplomats, legislators, heads of government, political party leaders, civic activists, journalists, and cabinet ministers. Luis Almagro, to my right, is a Uruguayan lawyer, diplomat, and politician who served as foreign minister from 2010 to 2015. He also served in diplomatic posts in Beijing and Tehran. And he currently serves as the 10th Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Hanna Hopko is a civic leader in Ukraine who has served as the chair of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. She was one of the group of young politicians who went from protest to politics following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Hanna is today traveling the world on behalf of her country's fight for its sovereignty and freedoms. Tawakkol Karman became known as the Lady of the Arab Spring in recognition of her role in the 2011 pro-democracy youth uprising in Yemen, for which she won the Nobel Peace Prize that same year. A journalist by training, she continues to give voice against corruption and authoritarianism, not only in Yemen, but around the world. Lassina Zerbo, the former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, who was deposed following the first of 2 military coups this year. I happened to be in Ouagadougou in 2015, following what was then a successful transition, and it has been a tragic situation this past 12 months. He is a world-renowned geophysicist who has championed arms control and nuclear non-proliferation. His efforts have been recognized by countries from Chile, the Dominican Republic, and Kazakhstan to the US, Japan, and Madagascar. I wanted to begin by asking each of you a question specific to your country and region. And given your international experiences, asking each of you to address more general questions regarding democratic challenges and opportunities after 15 years of what has been described as a global democratic recession. These broader issues, I think, are important because the threats to democracy, whether they relate to corruption, disinformation, political polarization, growing cooperation among autocracies, and independent media, all require a collective response by the international community. Hannah, I'll turn to you first.
Ladies first, as usual.
This conference has spent a good deal of time talking about Ukraine, as it should, and talking a great deal about the security of Ukraine, as it should. But as a former politician, I'd like to ask you a political question. The N-word, negotiations, has been on people's minds over the last several weeks. We heard President Zelensky outline his 10-point peace plan. But let me raise a hypothetical question to you. In a week or a month, President Putin says, I'm willing to sue for peace, to negotiate, with no preconditions. And my question is about Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian politics. If there is a push for premature negotiations, what impact would that have on the Zelensky government and democracy more broadly in Ukraine?
Thank you for this, I think, very important question, but 95% of the population believe that Ukraine is winning and Ukraine will defeat Russia. 95%. Around 89, almost 90% thinks now, after all these massive cruise missiles, ballistic rockets, kamikaze drone attacks on our critical infrastructure, which are happening these days in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Lviv, almost everywhere in Ukraine. It's like 9/11 is happening every day in Ukraine. So even after this, people think that we have to maintain resistance and continue our fight. So I think President Zelensky, he depends on people decision and what people think that the nation should do. We have to keep fighting until the complete victory comes. I just came from Taiwan and South Korea, and it reminded me also about last century when Ukrainian dissidents were also traveling to Taipei and Seoul. It was 1957, as I remember, when the Asian League of Anti-Communism, Asian Anti-Communism League of People was established. So I think it's really important to pass this message of geopolitical actuality of Ukraine defeating Russia. And it's not just about Ukraine, because everyone is focusing on Ukraine's security. I think we have to think globally. And during the world movement for democracy, where different people from 70 countries, from Africa, Latin America, were there, everyone was talking about how to defeat Russian colonialism, Russian imperialism, and why victory of Ukraine is so important. So, and answering on all these peace talks, you know that Ukrainian Council of National Security of Defense, they adopted a decision which, according to this decision, no negotiations with Putin. And this was also public position of our president. So, but what I could say, I remember 2014, 2015, when I entered to the parliament and became the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I truly believe at that time that all negotiations will result at least in the ceasefire, long-lasting ceasefire. 8 years of peaceful settlement of Russian aggression, when we were like encouraged that only political diplomatic way is the way to go. Ukrainians, please, do not ask weapons. No javelins for you. We received javelins only in 2016. It was too late. And after 8 years of Minsk Trilateral Contact Group, Normandy format, and many others, we ended up with genocide. So we are facing now, let's be very frank and clear, Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. And the same what happened in last century in Holodomor, a man-made famine organized by Stalin, when Ukrainians, just because we are Ukrainians, the breadbasket of Europe, we were dying because of hunger, a famine. And at that time, on November 16, the US established diplomatic relations with Soviet Union. And after Holodomor genocide, Holocaust happened. So I think it's really important to learn the lessons from history. And it's not just history within, you mentioned 15 years of democracy. I would say even from the Soviet Union disintegration, because it's really important, and even wider, because Peter the Great, when he renamed Muscovy in 1721, still in the name of Rus. Could you please raise hands to who visited Kiev in this room, audience? So almost everyone. You see the beauty of St. Sophia Cathedral, one of the most ancient. St. Sophia Cathedral was built at the beginning of 11th century, when Moscow didn't exist. So this is why our answer to all negotiations. It's about defeating Russian imperialism, that they never become a threat, not just for Ukraine, for Belarus, for Moldova, for Georgia, Venezuela, Syria, and not supporting China in potential attack on Taiwan and others. And also for me, it's about justice. Justice because all generations, millions of people who were suffering during Peter the Great times, Soviet Union, from Lenin to Stalin and others, millions of Ukrainians who died. They are asking from heaven, we have to win. So this is moral duty for us and my generation. And also as the mother of 12 years old daughter Sophia for last 9 years, actually I'm sacrificing my maternity because I have to bring victory to my country. But I have no doubt that my daughter's husband and her kids in the future will never fight with Russians, because such threat as Russia or Moscovia or Soviet Union will never exist and will never face it.
So I assume, Hannah, you would agree with James Traub, who wrote in Foreign Affairs just several weeks ago, that in this case, it's time to give war a chance.
It's time to receive more F-16 ATACMS, and actually democracy without weapons is blah, blah, blah. We received before. So actually, I hope we are here not just to make statements. Our armed forces, they're really the brightest and the most powerful forces. Ukrainian armed forces is de facto European armed forces. And it will be, and it is the best contribution to the, not just to protection of eastern flank of NATO. If you want to protect Poland, help us to defeat Russia.
Okay. Thank you, Hanna. Mr. Secretary General, one of the more positive developments over the past 4 decades in defending democracy on a regional and global level has been the emergence of a democratic architecture or ecosystem that includes governments, aid agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and networks of parliaments, political parties, and civil society activists. The Organization of American States seemed to move away from the principle of non-intervention among member states to a more activist role in places where democratic order was interrupted. Peru was a case in point in 2000. And the OAS Democratic Charter became a model for other regional groups, such as the African Union. But autocratic member states are now becoming more aggressive and smarter in subverting your personal efforts at the OAS. And Russia and China, it would seem, are trying to buy influence. How serious are these internal and external threats to intergovernmental groups like yours? And what outside assistance is needed for a pushback? And what internal reforms could be made to protect your democratic mission?
Yeah, this is for a book. First of all, of course, we have a very dynamic role, and it's mainly related to stabilize the democratic governance in the region. We have serious challenges related to that. We have applied Article 17 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter 8 times during this period. Right now, our mission is going back to Peru, arriving to Peru today, in order to bring stability and political dialogue into the political system. So we have permanently challenges we have had, of course, among these applying of Article 17. It was in Haiti, it has been in Peru twice, it has been in Guatemala and El Salvador. Plus, at the same time, of course, we have to support electoral transitions that sometimes become very difficult. And of course, we have been successful with that. Free political prisoners, and we have been successful with that. We freed, in beginning 2020, 320 political prisoners in Nicaragua. What I mean is that we act more like a moral force. We are an extreme poverty organization. We have the budget of a community college. Nevertheless, we play above our weight, and of course, we have to face permanently new dynamics and new challenges. We have 3 dictatorships now in the region, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. How this dictatorship permeates the rest of the political system is quite a challenge. How drug trafficking permeates the rest of the political system is another challenge. Violence and structural problems like violence and corruption, of course, are big challenges also in order to preserve democracy. We cannot touch the Inter-American Democratic Charter now, and we shouldn't go into a process to reform that, because it will only deteriorate. Today, it's impossible that we will have the consensus that we had in 2001. Impossible, practically. We don't have this enthusiasm for democracy that we used to have. These authoritarian regimes in the region, of course, they are playing their game. We are facing an enemy with deep pockets, and that is playing their game and trying to influence political campaigns and trying to influence, of course, the way that the institutions work. Our main challenge is to keep the fight for freedom and peace, as I said in the video. And that challenge, of course, is something that we have to shape up for the occasion, no matter how less scarce the resources are, no matter how serious is the challenge, and no matter how powerful and mighty are the autocratic enemies. We just have to keep doing our work. Defending institutions is something that it's an imperative in the region. I always hope that these political changes will just reinforce the need for democracy. Alternation in power is a good thing, and it has to be understood in that way. But at the same time, of course, keeping institutions alive, keeping an independent judiciary, keeping freedom of expression, and civil and political guarantees alive, keeping institutions operative and efficient. Those are the challenges that we have these days. We just keep working. We are professionals doing our job. I mean, and we have to respond to every single political crisis. I borrowed from some brands some mottos, and one of them is never hide, and the other one is don't crack under pressure, and the other one is we keep walking, and we keep walking no matter the circumstances.
Well, that's certainly the reputation that you have developed, Mr. Secretary General. And China and Russia?
You know, they are different things, completely different things. Of course, the Russian war in Ukraine is something that it bothers us a lot. And the future of democracy in the region, it will depend a lot of the outcome of that war. We are in Ukrainian hands in many ways. Democracy has to be strong. I mean, I said in the op-ed. I mean, when Athens lost to Sparta, then democracy deteriorated, and when they lost against Macedonia and Filippo, that was it. It was over after 500 years. Now we only have 300 years of democracy. So we have to shape up for the occasion. Democracy has to be strong to defend itself. And if something goes wrong in Ukraine, then the autocratic regimes of the region will feel much more entitled, and they will permeate in a harder way the rest of the political systems. And they will feel that they have a momentum in order to achieve, let's say, to push democracy back. So to keep democracy alive and strong, we depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine, because in the reverse, it will be a moment to push these autocratic regimes that it's not a moment for them in the world, it's not a moment for them in the region, and then we may achieve some substantial gains, I hope. China. I was ambassador to China for 3 years. China is the main trade partner and sometimes investor in most of the countries of the region. And that is something that is practically impossible to reverse. I mean, no matter how many trade agreements we can sign around, there is no other market like the Chinese market for Latin American and Caribbean commodities. At the same time, it was a cheap way to invest or to reinvest. So that cannot be taken away. What it has to be defended and preserved are the principles and values of democracy, not to give them away because of these trade gains or whatever. So it's something that, you know, when I was ambassador there, I asked them for four things, in fact, but one was for us. One was that not to buy land in Uruguay. I mean, they can buy the whole country with the return of the matchboxes. Not to bring workers to the country. Not to buy projects that they are already going on. So if they wanted to go to buy new ones. and of course not to take money from them. And somehow it worked for quite a while, and it was the base of a revelation that somehow it was praised a couple of 1 year ago, 2 years ago, that it worked in a very institutional way. But it's how you make China respect the asymmetries, and how you make China respect your principles and values. And that is it's mainly about you and about how you plant yourself with those principles and values. Because I have seen that what happened in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries, that they were too eager to give away everything because these principles and values, they didn't mean so much for them. So, but that is, I think, is quite a challenge, because we cannot, if at this moment you take away the whole Latin American trade export to China, it will be an economic disaster in the region. We can't afford that. And so we have to work on that and how we stand on that. And we have to see the future. I mean, I'm not saying that we should go to a Kissingerian. I'm talking too much. No. Yeah.
We'll come back.
Okay.
Tawako, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
You have seen your country go from a slowly emerging democracy, or more precisely, a more open political system, to virtually a failed state, whose citizens have experienced one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Given that the conflict became a proxy war by non-democratic states in the region, what beyond negotiations are needed to reach a real settlement to help return Yemen to where it was before? And is democratic government that you fought so hard for an elusive goal anymore?
Yeah. To answer this question, I will start with agreeing with Hannah when she said that Putin should be defeated in Ukraine. This is very important for all the people who are fighting, who are dreaming for democracy. What Ukrainian people now doing is they are trying to protect the democracy around the world. They are not just defend on Ukraine. The battle in Ukraine now is like the battle between Democrats and authoritarian regime, between democracy and dictatorship. And why it happens? Why Putin dare to occupy Ukraine? Because he didn't face a real position, a real any action against him when he killed people in Syria, when he supported Bashar al-Assad and he killed and pushed millions of people to flee from Syria. So talking about negotiation, it's very important. I was in Ukraine months ago with two of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, Lima Goboy from Liberia and Judy Williams from America. And we visited a lot of Ukrainian people, and oh my God, that was all their stories, most of it, it's the same stories in Yemen, the same stories in Syria. And also their demands for freedom, the same thing that people in our countries, suffer and also call for. So negotiations should lead to a just and a comprehensive and a sustainable peace in Yemen. When you return to Yemen, Yemen did a great peaceful revolution against the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. Under the rule of the dictator, Yemen was in the, how can I say it in English? They will announce it as a failed country.
So one of the reason of Yemeni revolution was for many things, all the crisis that and it was because of this dictator in economy, in political issue, in every field. So the peaceful revolution did a great work, and the peaceful revolution put Yemen in the beginning, in the gate of democracy and peaceful transition. And we won the battle of peaceful movement, and also we wrote the draft of constitution that will guarantee democracy in Yemen. The coup happened after that. The coup happened after the great national dialogue, great national negotiation with the previous regime. And the coup happened because it's supported by the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh, who has the immunity that gave him the platform to gather him again, to make alliance with Saudi Arabia, with Emirates again, the enemy of democracy in Yemen, and to wage the coup against Yemen. And also from other hand, with Houthi militia who make alliance with the Iran. So what Yemen is suffering now is suffering from a proxy war from Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Yemeni are, paying the price of dreaming for democracy, revolt for democracy, and sacrificing for democracy. Now we have now a temporary truce. It's a fragile temporary truce. But the question, so look, Yemeni people really want peace, and really ready for peace. And the only one who waged the wars in Yemen is the Saudi Arabia and Emirates from one hand, and Iran, who supported Houthi from other hand. And there is a very important when we talk about peace, when we talk about truce, and I am again in general I like the truce that make people a little bit calm, but not the truce that will prepare for a big war after that. When you talk about peace in Yemen, they are talking about just the war between Houthis and Saudi Arabia. They don't talk about the sustainable peace that will lead to really lead to stability in Yemen. For example, when you talk about peace, they have to stop the sending missiles to Saudi, and the Saudi has to stop the bombs. And is this the war in Yemen? Of course not. Saudi Arabia and Emirates are occupying Yemen, are occupying its lands, its islands, its airports, its ports. All of this under their hegemony and control. And none of this, when they talk about peace, they don't talk about Saudi should withdraw all their, affiliation in this, in this area. The same thing with Houthis. Okay, Houthis should stop it should stop the peace, and it's just the message. Okay, what about their weapons? What about their weapons? And they believe, and their racism method that want Yemeni to be under their, rule for decades as their divine rule. So it needs to know what is the peace. Listen to the people, what they want. What is the peace that really will lead to the? So Putin should not achieve any goals in Ukraine that will guarantee the democracy around the world. Because if Putin wins this battle, the battle of authoritarian, the camp of authoritarian regimes will be the leader of the future. The leader of the future. And now, when the Western governments, what they claim themselves that they are democrat, they give him the green light when they didn't defend the dreams of people in Syria. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Prime Minister, civil society in Burkina Faso played a central role, an extraordinary role in 2014 in the demand for the restoration of democracy. When the then President, Compaoré, tried to extend his 27-year rule. In a series of coups this year, which of course you were a victim, the same civil society groups have become, from my observations, relatively quiet. Perhaps because of the inability of a democratic government and governments to deal with a serious Islamic insurgency. What does it say about linkages between security and the ability of democracy to deliver? And do you believe the Burkina Faso military will turn to Russian mercenary forces, as Mali has done, to defend its rule, suppress the civilian population, and to take on the insurgency? And finally, how effective are these Russian forces, the Wagner Group, in the long term in the West African Sahel? Will we see them 5 years from now?
Thank you, Ken. Look, last night when I received a text from a friend of mine telling me, you must be kidding to be in a panel where they talk about democracy. Your country just suffered 2 military coups. How can you talk about democracy? And then I asked myself, should I come to the panel? But I'm happy to be here, to be in this panel, and then I thank the Halifax Forum for making me sit on the future of democracy. You're right, civil society in 2014 played a big role in what we call l'insurrection in Burkina Faso. But civil society at that time was nascent. When I say nascent, they were independent. It was after a long period of government, 27 years, by President Compaoré. And then the population had evolved a lot. Today, Burkina Faso, you talk about 75% of the population below 30. That's a ticking bomb. And that's something that the government at the time should have anticipated. So they were organized. There were NGOs that were coming, talking to the younger generation, people who were coming from the Western countries or East where they've studied, and who were thirsty of seeing change in the country. And those are the people who brought the change in 2014. So why we see them quiet today? Simply because civil society has been politicized. They're not as independent as they were in 2014. Because the essence of civil society is its independence from the state. It's also its self-reliance, which is not the case today in Burkina Faso. Same as our army has been politicized. Politicized, you have different factions in the army who believe in different political system or political alliances. So that is not helping the country to survive 2014 and then to continue in the democratic regime that has started with the transition, the successful transition, and President Kabore, who has started. But you see, one understanding is that it was too easy for the democratic regime to come because it was a party that had only 2 years that won the election. So they had probably difficulty shaping themselves around this new role that they're playing after 27 years of power from President Compaoré. And then they didn't adapt themselves well to the reality of the country. And this has basically changed the way the youth perceived democracy, the way the youth perceived accountability from a government, and then the way they were still thirsty of coming and play an important role. So what happened I was called to come and contribute. I'm not a political figure. I'm a public figure, as I said. And then we suffered 2 military coups. We suffered the 2 military coups. What I want to say is that reporters that talk about exactly what happened in our countries are not always as clear in what they say. Because I was sitting home and then watching television where they were saying that I was arrested, tortured, and then I was in a military camp, and then I was basically at home. But how that can be translated to the media, that the military coup was so violent, that the president, the prime minister, the speaker of the parliament were under arrest and then they were tortured, that's a different story. So now, coming to how we overcome this situation, I would simply say democracy in Burkina Faso or in any other country, especially in our part of the world when you have over 50 or 60% of illiteracy, is difficult. When people can choose or think for themselves, act with purpose, it's difficult for them to express or live democracy. So you asked the question about Wagner. Look, I haven't experienced Wagner in Burkina Faso. I can't talk about Wagner. I heard of Wagner in Mali, but that's probably someone else to talk about. So now the perception of like what happened 2 days ago when 100 or 150 people go to a Western country embassy and then try to push them away and then raise a Russian flag, I think it's more linked to the gap that others are living, and then the experience of a neighboring country that seems to be attractive to people who really don't understand what they're doing. I don't think it's something that is physically or practically instrumentalized by a specific country, because I didn't live that. I didn't feel that. So I'll give you an example of somebody who had a flag, a Russian flag, and then the radio came to him and then said, which flag is this? He said, no, I don't know. But how did you get it? Oh, I was given the flag to just demonstrate. So when you talk to somebody who doesn't even know what flag is holding, and then when you have a situation where even a military, which is a low-level military officer holding a different country's flag, which is completely against what would be in a military system, that tells you that we need probably more education, more training for people to understand, to try to think for themselves, to act with purpose. And that will help them to make a difference between what is good for them and what is not good for them.
Thank you. Why don't we turn it now to the audience for questions? I'd like to then at the very end, hopefully to leave on an optimistic note, to ask the panelists a question at the very, very end. So we'll leave a couple minutes at the very end. Yes? And please identify yourself if you could.
My name is JJ Omojua from Nigeria. If you look at the map of the world in the year 2000, about 22 years ago, most of the countries, so if you used blue for America, you will see that it's a blue map in terms of how people traded between, whether they were trading with China mostly or the US. It was a blue map. 20 years later, when you look at that map, it's mostly red, especially outside of North America. Everywhere else is mostly red. That's China. Most people are trading with China. And we have found that democracy is not automatic. For several years, countries were incentivized to become democratic, whether through foreign aid, through some form of grants and other such things. And we have seen how this has reduced. So a situation where Aid is reducing because aid is finding excuses elsewhere, finding reasons to be expressed elsewhere. Aid is reducing. America's influence is reducing. People don't think they need to do business with America because they have the option of China. In places like Sudan, where Putin is stealing gold to fund the war in Ukraine, ordinarily in the past, Sudan would check itself because it would need something from the United States. How can democracy thrive in a situation where most countries around the world, especially most poor countries around the world, don't see the need to listen or to do business with countries like the US, like Canada, like the United Kingdom? I think I will put that to you.
To me?
Mr. Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I go, please. Okay. I was a Democrat in Uruguay, not because I was friendly with the United States or with the United Kingdom. It was because it was my feeling and the feeling of most of the people of the country. Grew up during a dictatorship. Since I was 10 years old till I was 22 years old. And I just don't want that back in my country. And I'm coming from the radical left of my country. The group where I was coming took arms at a certain moment, fought a guerrilla. Nevertheless, they never claudicate on trying to make the country a more democratic country. And freedom is definitely an imperative within the country. We also have the feeling that sometimes you are left alone. I mean, for 12 years we had a dictatorship. Yesterday, the Iranian lady here was calling for help, like Cubans called for help 1 year ago, like Venezuelans called for help 3, 4, 5 years ago, like Nicaraguans called for help 3, 4 years ago, and nobody came. Democracy mainly was left to be defended by them and fought by them. And it has to be, the international community has to be, let's say, better tools in order to force democratic transitions. The international community has to have better tools in order to promote democracy and human rights and to defend human rights around. For example, my organization, it's not mine, belongs to 34 member states. This organization, we face the challenges, of course, of seeing these countries, Venezuela and Nicaragua, falling into dictatorships. And we applied all the legal tools that we had in the organization in order to stop or try to stop that, but it was not enough, definitely not enough. We always need to be committed to democracy internally, to be yourself democratic no matter what, and of course enforce the people with that. But at the same time, when you are facing oppressive regimes with indiscriminate use of force, like is happening in Iran now, is happening in Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua, it is impossible to leave the people alone facing that kind of challenge. How can you disarm people? The Venezuelans, imagine 9 million people in risk of hunger, 7 million people that have to migrate the country. How can you fix that? How can you ask them to change a regime that just uses violence in any possible way, torture people, put people in prison, kill people, 10,000 extrajudicial executions per year? And you want these people to face them alone, an authoritarian regime like that? It is practically impossible that democracy would prevail facing this kind of people. So it's how we can have better tools, because those tools of the 20th century, they are over. They don't exist anymore. And good that they are over forever. Are the new tools that are needed for the 21st century. And it has to do with your question about transformations for the international organizations. For this international organization, the United Nations Charter doesn't have the word democracy anywhere. And so most of the constituency that don't believe in democracy, that is a fact. But there, where there are true believers in democracy, they have to be supported, and we need to have better tools in order how they can confront organized crime, a state taken by organized crime, the levels of corruption, the levels of human rights violations, of crimes against humanity. Justice is part of the challenge, but definitely we need always to ask for the help that is requested in order to defend democracy, and this help somebody has to pay the bill for that. I mean, these people usually are in the streets they cannot afford. I mean, you can afford 1 week of demonstrations, 2 weeks of demonstration, and the third week you are struggling. 3 months later you are over. I mean, and that is what we need to address. I mean, if we want to support freedom fighters, if we want to support democracy, if we want to work the democratic transitions, then the engagement of the international community is extremely necessary. And, but of course, it has to be done with the new tools of the 21st century.
We have time for 2 quick questions. In the way back, the energetic person that is waving.
Thank you very much. Because I was at the very back, I had to try a little bit more.
You succeeded.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sabrina. I'm from Afghanistan, and I had been in a plenary session last year where, right after what had happened in Afghanistan in August 15, 2021. And everybody knows that democracy have been, the very young 20-year-old democracy of Afghanistan have been buried there. And the peace negotiation efforts has failed and become an extension of war. The fate of a nation has been into the hands of a terrorist group who have ties with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this all means dishonoring the sacrifices and the investment that the world has done for the more than 20 years in Afghanistan, and also the energy and the efforts that the Afghan nations have done towards that. Today we are all scattered around the world without no land, with no voice, with no platform, and we don't know where to start. So my question to the panel, and especially to Tawakkul from Yemen, who might know a little more from perspective of women's life in religious-dominated government countries, that how do you see the future of democracy when you look at Afghanistan as a failure of a democratic process and efforts of the world, if we do not look back, learn from mistakes, and try to correct things that have been done wrongly? Thank you.
Tawakkul.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad that
end in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm so glad that Afghanian woman, she's asking this very important question, and I think what happened in Afghanistan, it's kind of betrayal from America against Afghanistan. I'm sorry to say that, because what happened in Afghanistan, it's kind of hand-overing the authority in Afghanistan to Taliban. After all these decades of claiming that they are in Afghanistan to protect democracy and to save people, and at the end, they give it to those, to this authoritarian regime, to those who, use the religion against people, against democracy, against human rights. But I believe in people. I really believe in people. I am so sad, I am so angry how America did in Afghanistan when they started their war, and they didn't, after 20 years, they didn't make any basement for democracy. They didn't guarantee no security and no democracy. And they left Afghan people alone. But at the same time, I am really know that the Afghan people, one day, they will make change again. And as now the Iranian people, the great Iranian people, women and men, are making a great peaceful revolution against the mullahs, the authoritarian regimes in Iran, and they going to against their imama. So all the change will create by people who are really want the victory for freedom and democracy, and who will never lose this battle. So with optimism, we the people, in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, you know what happened in Egypt? That there was a Western conspiracy against them, and who support the army coup in Egypt. Let me to speak with you in frank way. You are talking that you said that you want democracy, you want to protect democracy, you want to, okay, the coups in Egypt, who support them? So the only way, the biggest challenge that face the Democrat people, the Democrat fighters, is the conspiracy from Western governments who claimed that they support democracy. When they support the military coup, when they support the militia, and why I'm talking about Western governments? Of course, Russia and China, they are the head of conspiracy, and at the head of, they are against democracy. But now the question, if you want the democracy to prevail, please really support the democracy around the world. Don't make conspiracy against them. And that will also save the democracy in your countries. What is happening now with the rise of far rights, it's the result of not the people, not the NGOs, no, the policy of governments against democracy in the world. So I am optimistic about the future. The future will be bright. I am so proud of the result of the midterm election in the United States that's made by the young people, not by the eldest who create all this chaos, not by the racist people, by the youngest people who will lead the future of the world, in America, in Canada, in everywhere.
Thank you, Tuako. I'm going to take the chair, the prerogative of the chair, to ask just a final question. Very, very quickly, I know we were a couple minutes over already. Madeleine Albright, who was my chair for 20 years at NDI, and I know, like many of you, there isn't a day that passes that I don't miss her presence and her voice. She called herself an optimist who worried a lot. And a year ago, she wrote an important article called The Coming Democratic Revival, in which she argued that despite the drumbeat of bad news, democracy could be poised for a comeback. And she cited 4 reasons. 1, it is easier to move upward from a valley than a peak. Many of today's troubled democracies were under authoritarian rule 30 years ago, meaning that Democrats are on a higher plateau from which to mount a revival. 2, the rise of authoritarianism over the past 2 decades has taken place against the backdrop of international terrorism, the 2008 global financial meltdown, the Syrian war, a global refugee crisis, and a health pandemic. These events stoke popular fears, frustrations, panic, and anger, with blame often directed at elected leaders. The next 20 years can hardly be less conducive to democratic growth. And finally, China and Russia have squandered the best opportunity they ever had to offer a convincing alternative to liberal democracy. They are failing. This was her view. And finally, the same forces that have fueled the rise of demagogues, including the human desire for change, could undermine the staying power of authoritarian regimes now old enough to embody the status quo. Do you agree with Madeleine's optimism here? 30 seconds for each one of you. Mr. Prime Minister.
I tend to agree with what Madeleine Albright said, because when you reach the bottom, there's no other way than rising up. And that's why there is optimism in a country like Burkina Faso. There is a triple challenge in Burkina Faso and in the Sahel. Security with the terrorism. I think the Afghan lady mentioned how they end up with terrorism. We need to fight and win the fight against terrorism in the Sahel. The same way the outcome of the Ukraine war will be the future of democracy, the same way the outcome of the war against terrorists in the Sahel will lead the future of democracy in that region. The second is development. And then the third, human rights. If you don't have those two, you can't talk about human rights. You can't come in a camp where you see internally displaced people with young kids, not knowing what they do, not even knowing where are their parents because they've been running around. And then their future, there's no future for them. When there's no future for youth, there's no democracy. And that's what happened in 2014. And that's what we would have hoped if they had the level of education to face military coup and then to come out and then speak for themselves, act with purpose. We wouldn't have coup again. We need to win our fight against this habit in West Africa to have military coup and then be endorsed by the institutional framework that we have. And that's something that we should stop. And that will lead us to a democratic government, hopefully in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and elsewhere.
Thank you. Tuako, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with her, but also, as I said, that I really believe in people, that people in Yemen will prevail this battle for freedom and democracy in all Arab countries, in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in everywhere people fight for democracy and freedom. But talking about terrorism, it's very important. If you want to fight terrorism, you should fight tyranny. The dictatorship lead to terrorism, result to terrorism. Every dictator is a terrorist, and every terrorist is a dictator. They feed each other, they support each other, and they gain the results and their goals with each other. So it's very important for the international community, especially with Western governments, that we hope that they will return to defend on their values, not their interests, to stop their alliance with the dictators. If they want to stop terrorism, they have to stop their alliance with dictators, because dictatorship result all the kind of terrorists.
Hannah?
We met several times with Madeleine Albright, and she mentioned that there will be 4 countries where the destiny of the world will be decided, and Ukraine is one of the countries. So I agree.
Nigeria, Colombia, and Indonesia.
Yeah, so I agree with Madeleine Albright. I would like to say that after more than 70 years of being in Soviet prison, Ukraine renewed independence, and now we are security guarantor for the democracy globally. So this is optimism. So actually, after Ukraine defeating Russia, I'm even more optimistic. Because if today we discuss that next year Halifax Forum could meet in Yalta, I think we could meet not even in Yalta. We could meet somewhere in Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Yakutia, meet Rzya people, Udmurtia, and others. So this is the dream because it's about human rights, it's about dignity, it's about defending the rights of these indigenous people. And I'm thankful to Halifax for the first Hala dinner when we have this voice of indigenous people. And I'm honored to meet a representative of Uyghurs here. So actually, summarizing, don't be afraid. This is the quote of President Biden in Warsaw, the quote of St. Paul. But don't be afraid, actually, to recognize your mistake. I saw some American faces when my friend were mentioning the failure that the US betrayed in Afghanistan. So actually, sometimes it's really important to be brave, to recognize, because the success would have been happen if the West prevent the genocide in Ukraine, and not now building the coalitions, thinking how to delay with weapons because of lack of strategy on Russia, on China. Ukraine defeating Russia is weakening China. So this is, I'm kindly asking, don't be afraid to recognize your failures and actually that your deterrence strategy of Russia also failed. And actually, I want to add optimism. Also, don't be afraid to dream bigger, to have big dreams. My dream is one day to visit Red Square in Moscow, and we will be opening 2 memorials on the genocide, Holodomor from last century made by Stalin, and second genocide made by current totalitarian regime. So this is only by not just reparations matter, international tribunal, but also Russian Sikh society is a problem. Because Russian Sikh society allowed Putin grow into the totalitarian regime. So Russia, through repentance and establishing these monuments, this is how they will recognize that millions of people were killed in last century and now. So this is the way to go.
Louise, Peter is ready to storm the stage, so just very short.
Yeah, very short. I agree with Madeleine Albright. I am an optimist and I worried a lot. I think we have a fair chance. I mean, vulnerabilities here expressed and some others can be fought and can be fought back, and definitely victory can be on the side of democracy in a very easy way. Just to engage in the issue is the matter, and it's about that. And so we have a fair chance about that. And of course, if you have to face tyranny, I mean, and I always like the phrase of Churchill, no? Face the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. But it's better that when the superpower comes into action and fix a couple of the issues.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your courage.
Peter?
Ken, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I'm not going to sum up. I just have about 30, 45 minutes of remarks.
Keep them brief.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am going to sum up. Number one, Ukraine is saving democracy. All Ukrainians are heroes. Number two, if you love freedom, you will continue to support Ukraine's fight for freedom because it's a fight for all of us. Everything becomes easier when Putin fails in Ukraine. And number three, when democracies walk together, they can do anything. And so I just want to echo Hannah, echoing the President of the United States of America, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Everybody here in this room knows that. Go home, tell your legislators, tell your governments, don't be afraid. Democracy is the future because the alternative is not an alternative. So that's it. That's what's at stake. You all know that. Make it happen. Safe trip home.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the Halifax International Security Forum. Thank you for joining the conversation.